good morning, or whatever time zone you're in from around the world. This next session will feature our widely known and respected Michael Raadt from Moodle headquarters. For those of you who don't happen to have heard of Michael, quite rare, in a past life he was the senior lecturer in IT at University of Southern Queensland here in Australia. Then he was helping our community as the Moodle Development Manager at HQ in Perth. Currently he's Research Director at headquarters, and he's promoting research and organises our Moodle MOOCs. Today he's going to take us on a journey and challenge us as to whether we should follow some of the newest trends. Is there in fact evidence-based research on any or all of these? Just a quick check, if any of you have just joined us, there is a pre-presentation survey which is available at bit.ly/iMoot myths. Over to you, Michael. That's okay. Looks like Michael's just stepped out of the room for a second. I'm sure he'll be back in a minute.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now? The wonders of technology right there. Great. Well, before we get started, I was hoping to share with you a bit of a survey. So if you haven't already done so, and I want to give people a minute or two to do this, there's a URL on the screen there, or you can, if you're already in the course, which you might have been in to get to here, the survey is on the course for this presentation. So if you just go to that and fill it in, and I'll sort of gabber on in the background here. I might skip back and give a bit of a personal introduction while people are filling that in. So I'll skip back a few slides here, if it'll let me. Okay, back to the beginning. So my name is Michael Raadt, as introduced. If you're doing Twitter in the background, Salvatore, S-A-L-V-E-T-O-R-E, is my personal handle. But if you're interested in following some interesting Moodle-related research, and I try to keep this quite topical, Moodle research is my sort of professional alias at the moment, and you can find out some information of interest by following that handle. A bit about me. I am a normal person. I have a family, a wife, 2 kids. At the moment, I'm living in Canberra in Australia, the nation's capital. But we've been getting around. The photo top left there is us recently in the Netherlands. We were staying there for about 3 months. And before that, we were living in Perth, before Perth in Queensland. And I grew up in New South Wales in Australia, so I've been around the country a fair bit. I have a PhD, mostly focused on computing and education, and a few other bits and pieces. I've been an academic and done the research life. I've played that game, and before I came to Moodle, I was involved in development, particularly of plugins. And in the last 4 years, I was managing developers at Moodle HQ, and now since the beginning of the year, and it seems like it's been quite a while already, I've been sort of in a different role trying to promote research in and around Moodle and organising things like that. So my role, organising the Moodle MOOCs, and I'll mention a couple in a minute, reading a lot of research papers and trying to get people talking about them, raising things of interest to the community, and putting things out on Twitter, and quite a few sort of presentations like this one and others, just to try and get people talking about Moodle and research. Coming up in a few months' time are two things that I've been involved in the organisation of. So Moodle Moot in Australia is happening in July, and if you're in the neighbourhood, or if you're not, you're quite welcome to come along to that. We're starting to put out the program. We've had a whole bunch of presentations accepted to that, and we're filling in the blanks now. Moodle Moot in the US is happening in August. At the moment, it's scaling up to be quite a large event. So certainly for those people in the US, there's still an opportunity for people to be putting in presentation proposals, and I suspect it's probably going to be the largest Moodle Moot in the world probably ever. All right, going back to the survey, I wanted to sort of show the survey, and I'm gonna attempt this. Let's see what happens when I do. All right. Okay, let's see if I can drag this over here. All right, so on the screen now, can I make this bigger? Anyway, on the screen now, you'll see the results. Maybe I can refresh this, see if we get the latest, over a couple of questions that are relevant to this presentation. I'll just go through them one at a time and let's see what people thought. So we had 34 responses here. The first question was, drinking less than 6 to 8 glasses of water a day can cause your brain to shrink. Not many people were agreeing with that, only 4. Most people thought that was false. The next question, we mostly use 10% of our brain. 58% of people, so a majority of people think that's true, and a few think that's false. It's interesting, that was trending up around 80% when I checked it last night, about 10 hours ago. Individuals prefer to learn better when they receive information in their preferred learning style. About 73% agree with that, and 26, so a majority of people definitely agreeing with that one. Digital native students are more tech savvy than their digital immigrant teachers. There's quite a few people that think that's true, but the majority think that's actually false. MOOCs will replace current teaching practices. A couple of people think that's true, but the majority, almost everybody, think that's false. Problem-based learning is more effective than transmission models. Quite a large majority think that is true. Learning analytics are a game changer. There's about 2/3 of people thinking that's true, and quite a few people, a third, though, think it's false. Humans are responsible for global warming. Actually, that was 100% last night. A few people have been brave and stepped out and given a negative answer. There's a couple of joke questions after that as well that I'm not going to address too seriously, but they were there just to fill out the questions. Okay. Let me see if I can stop this now. Close. All right. So now we should be back to the main presentation, and you will hopefully see how these might become relevant. All right, cool. So what am I talking about here? Myths. I'm not really talking about, stories from long ago and things like that. I'm talking about ideas that have become considered true without necessarily, any evidence to back them up. And I'm going to be examining some of these educational ideas to see whether there's evidence in, literature or whatever to say whether they're true, or if there's even contrary evidence to say that they shouldn't be true, just to sort of challenge people and perhaps what they're doing in practice in their everyday teaching. Okay. The first question in that survey was drinking less than 6 to 8 glasses of water a day can cause the brain to shrink. This is pretty innocuous. It's not really that related to education, but it was a good question to throw in there first. I was inspired by a particular study. This Howard Jones study had a few of these questions starting off, and it was questioning a few educational ideas, and it threw in a few of these more common everyday ideas to see whether people were agreeing with them or not. And you can see there that there was a survey that was conducted in different countries around the world, and so got various levels of agreement in different places. But generally people didn't agree with that, and they're quite rightly true. You do need to stay hydrated. Your brain does obviously need water in order to function correctly, but this notion that you need to have a minimum amount of water per day in those particular quantities doesn't seem to have any reliable source, and it doesn't seem to be necessarily true. But it's interesting how ideas like that have caught on. Even when I was in Malaysia, I was at a conference there recently, and I was given a bottle of water, and on the side it had exactly that. Have you had your 8 glasses of water a day? So maybe this is just something that's born out of the bottled water industry. I'm not sure. Just while people are talking about audio problems, can everyone hear me correctly? Can I get a yes from a few people to say that they can hear me? Oh, good. I shall continue on. The next one, we mostly only use 10% of our brain. Now, this was one that quite a few people in our survey agreed with. A majority of people actually said that this was true in that survey. How does that bear up with the same sort of study that I mentioned before? Well, it's pretty much the same, almost between 50 and 60%, which matches up with the survey that we just looked at. The problem is that that is not true. It is something that has come about. There have been studies into people's brain damage and how much of their brain they can survive without. It is definitely not true if you study the brain, and I'm not a scientist who looks at brain patterns and so forth, but people have done this obviously, and they can see that we do in fact use all of our brain, and you need to have full use of your brain in order to function as a normal human being. If you were only able to use 10% of your brain, you'd be less than a vegetable. Anyway, but it again, it sort of indicates how an idea like this can be popularized, particularly in movies and fiction, and how it can be sort of become almost true in people's minds. Now, the next one I would say is definitely more related to education and what we've been talking about in this conference. And I would say it's not quite as clear-cut and a bit more controversial, but I think it's worth challenging. So we had in our survey about 3/4 of people agreeing with this statement that individuals learn better when they receive information in their preferred learning style. And the same study that I mentioned a little while ago showed that an even stronger agreement with that around the world. And it's something that people are applying in real teaching practice. They're spending a lot of time and energy to determine people's various learning styles, and then trying to capitalize on that in their teaching. But is it actually true? Well, the Howard Jones study that I've been mentioning all along has this quote: "Reviews of educational literature and controlled laboratory studies fail to support this approach to teaching." In other words, the evidence for this notion of learning styles in general is quite lacking, and there have been a number of studies that have tried to to attack this to see whether it's true or not. Here's another piece of quote from literature. The present results suggest that people's intuitions about learning styles may be incorrectly attributed. So that's from a paper from 2006. And they sort of suggest basically that we want it to be true. Why would we want it to be true? Well, I guess in people's minds, and this is something I've seen, theorized, being able to quantify someone's sort of learning style makes them easier to categorize and therefore possibly easier to teach. So we do want some sort of tool like this that we can employ to make our own job easier as teachers and possibly to improve education for students. The literature fails to provide adequate support for applying learning style assignments in school settings. In other words, evidence doesn't sort of show that if you do take someone's learning style and attempt to cater for it, it doesn't necessarily help in practice. So, all right, there are literally hundreds of learning style inventories. Perhaps some of them are true. Perhaps some of them have more validity than others. I think some of them have as much validity as a personality quiz in a glossy magazine, but are any of them true? I'm not sure. But I would sort of say that evidence is starting to weigh against the use of learning styles. There tends to be two camps in this debate, really. You've got educational theorists, people who in many cases are promoting these particular learning style inventories and in some cases profiting from them. And then you've got another camp, which are usually psychologists, people actually trying to understand whether these things work in a physical way in people's brains and so forth, whether they are valid. And you've got this sort of this warring battle going on between them. And I'd say that in the literature, the psychologists seem to have the upper hand at the moment. Now, we as educators sitting back, perhaps sitting on the fence and wanting to be told what we should do, what can we do in our Moodle courses, in our general teaching, if we are to sort of say, well, if learning styles is questionable, what can we do instead? My advice would be that we want to design content in content-appropriate forms of instruction. So think about the relevance of the modalities that you're using to present things. And if something is appropriate to the content, then probably you're going to be presenting it in a relevant way. That's not to say that you shouldn't consider multiple modalities, because presenting things in multiple modalities can help people's understanding still, and that still is held to be well accepted. But perhaps you don't necessarily have to provide something in all modalities to perhaps cater for every learning style, or you don't necessarily have to target particular people's learning styles with certain modalities. Okay, so there's a question here. Considering you can take the Myers-Briggs 5 times and get 5 different results, it's funny that talks about stable personality types. Yes, so there is debate even among educational theorists whether learning styles, if they are true, are stable over someone's life, or whether there's something that represents someone at a particular point of time. I myself have used the VARK, VARK, which is something born out of New Zealand, and it, in my mind, had some validity at the time, but I've since sort of questioned that. But it does provide us with a good idea of what we can do to get different representations of things in visual or auditory and things like that. But I wouldn't my studies found that students were inconsistent from time to time, and trying to cater for particular learning styles in my own teaching was fruitless. But maybe that's something people can take away. All right, that's probably the most challenging one. Let's move on to something less challenging. Digital native students are more tech savvy than their digital immigrant teachers. Again, this comes down to putting people in boxes, I think, and certainly categorizing people according to their generations and so forth has been a practice that we've been going on with for a long time. In the quiz, we had people who were talking about, in the survey, we had about a third of people thought that this was true and two-thirds thought it was false. There have been some studies that have tried to figure out whether this is true with evidence and so on. This one from Wang in late last year, actually. Teachers' age and technology skill could not be identified as the cause of the disconnect between students' use of technology. In other words, they couldn't find a difference that said, if this student's this age, they'll be more, adept at using technology or not. Recent research has shown flaws in the argument that there is an identifiable generation or even a single type of highly adept technology user. And so basically, there's not really a great consistency across generations for skills. In other words, we've got a variety of people of different ages with different levels of skill. Going back to our teaching practices, with this idea in mind, if we can dispel it, what should we do instead? Well, I think we should provide appropriate teacher training. Obviously, we've got teachers with a lot of variety of skill, so we need to help them to become more skillful to use the tools that they need to use for teaching. And I think in general, there's a fair bit of fear-mongering about students and whether they're going to be smarter than us or not. But in general, I think we can be confident as teachers that we use technology, teaching technology, more than students because we're forced to. It's our job. So we can gain confidence from that and perhaps not be so worried about a generation of students coming along making our task redundant as teachers. They should be smarter than us, at least in the sort of discipline that we're trying to purvey. Okay. Moving on. MOOCs. Here's a controversial topic. MOOCs will replace current teaching practices, and I think I made that statement a bit too stark in the survey. I think it didn't raise enough controversy. So only 2 people thought that was true, and the rest of people thought that were false. But we may have a slightly biased sample in this particular conference. Mostly the people here, I suspect, are educators, and many are working in situations where a MOOC would mean a challenge or something different to what we're currently doing. So I might have made that a bit too easy to disagree with. Some people are doing that. So we do, yes. MOOCs in general have been something that Moodle has been involved with for a long time. Moodle is used as a MOOC platform around the world. It's not as synonymous with MOOCs as other learning management systems who promote themselves solely as a platform for MOOCs. So it doesn't have the same press, I think, in that regard. But yeah, there's definitely people running MOOCs around the world at the moment. Let's have a look at some evidence about the use of MOOCs. The highest completion rate, this was a study of multiple MOOCs around the world. So the highest completion rate achieved was 19.2%. The majority of MOOCs had completion rates less than 10%. That's actually a website where they're continually collecting data about MOOCs. So MOOCs are not retaining students. They're not taking a majority of students through to completion. And this is sort of accepted as a known thing, but in one sense it means that MOOCs cannot simply replace our current methods of teaching. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're not useful, but in a way it won't be just a clean replacement. Less than 38%, this is from the US Campus Computing Survey, which is IT or professionals in colleges in the US. And they said less than 38% of respondents agreed that MOOCs offer a viable model for effective delivery of online instruction, which was down from 53% in 2013. In other words, there's a sort of a downward trend in the positivity about MOOCs, and particularly in the tertiary sector. I think there has been a lot of hype around MOOCs, and whether that will serve them well into the future, I wonder. So, yeah, I think that does show that people are considering they're not necessarily viable at a tertiary level, at least for sort of teaching that people are familiar with. And from that same paper, the term MOOC mania was quoted. So they suggested that MOOC mania is over, but that doesn't necessarily mean that MOOCs are going to go away. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think they're just settling in. So MOOCs will have a place in online education when used appropriately. I don't see in the next 10 years or so that they would be replacing our traditional tertiary level of education, but they will be supplementing it in some ways. And I think universities around the world are starting to use them as a teaser, get students in, get them hooked on education, loyal to a particular institution, and then to continue them into regular courses from there onwards. I'm just going back to a few comments now from the chat. Completion does not necessarily relate to level of learning. So that's probably true. There are obviously some people that are benefiting from them. Yeah, so quite a different purpose. I think it's worth distinguishing that purpose. Many lurkers, yes, indeed. In truth, I mean, there's not that much difference between what could be considered a good MOOC course and a good online course in general. There is obviously scale and level of instructor involvement that differs, but still a lot of the setup and content and assessment will be much the same. So hopefully we'll all benefit from an expansion in the use of MOOCs in the future if it is going to take place, and so will students. We'll see. Problem-based learning is more effective than transmission models. And from the survey of iMoot participants, going back to that one, it was 85% of people agreed that this was true, and about 15, I guess, percent, 14 and a bit, said that it was not true. Well, I wonder, what does evidence say about this? Dick Clark has done quite a few studies into this. Requiring students to discover what they need to learn results in 45% less learning than demonstrating how to solve problems. The most vulnerable students are harmed the most. So it's less effective than directly instructing someone and it tends to harm strugglers the most. Why are people using this at all, if that is the case? I'll come back and answer that in a minute. 1 minute of explicit training can be more effective than months of implicit training. That's from a really interesting study that I would encourage you to read from back in 1987, and this one was something that I relied on a lot in my PhD research. Explicit training, explicit instruction is more effective than implicit instruction. So in other words, if you can show someone something directly rather than getting them to learn it themselves through trial and error and so forth, it's going to be more effective over time. I think what a lot of people are confusing is constructivism, which is encouraging learners to build an understanding of something with unguided learning. I think that there's got to be a distinction there where you provide the scaffolding that is needed for learning through explicit instruction, and then you allow students to explore that understanding through problem-based learning or through some sort of exploratory means. I think where this can be abused is where the advantages or the perceived benefits of problem-based learning are considered to be so strong that it's used as a primary learning mechanism in fundamental stages. So you've got, introductory sort of engineering or nursing or something like that, something where there are fundamental facts, principles, and so on that have to be learned first, being approached from a problem-based learning method. I'm not sure if that would be advisable. So going back to the chat, we've got, what about using both? Instruction plus, yes, definitely, but I think the order would be explicit first, then more exploration. I've seen in schools where kids simply don't know what they need to find out as a subject, and they need the skill set first, definitely. Depends on learners and whether they have ever been self-directed learners. They need scaffolding. Exactly, yes, that's true. Makes a lot of sense, so some agreement there. Okay. Yeah, definitely we need to, if you're going to start to use PBL, problem-based learning, you want to be aware of how it should be done rather than just taking the load off yourself and giving the students exploratory tasks. All right, moving onward. Socioeconomic factors are the best predictor of success. What are socioeconomic factors? Someone's background, where they're living, and so on. In an individual course, if someone is compared, so someone from a more well-off socioeconomic background compared to someone who's struggled more, is it actually true that they are more likely to succeed? Not really. According to Whitmer, John Whitmer, he was involved in some research in and around Moodle and learning analytics a few years back. LMS use is the better predictor of potential academic achievement, better than demographic factors, even previous grades. So participation, involvement is the best predictor. So we can still consider someone's background and even their previous grades and whether or not they'll need assistance going through a course, but if we can get them involved, that is the key. So we as educators, if we are to sort of put our blinkers on and say, how do we help students the best? Use regular assessment and activities to encourage involvement. and obviously to monitor students who are uninvolved and to try and get them to participate. Don't assume that the good students will always go through and that the poor students will fail. In your course, you can help them still. All right, learning analytics are a game changer. This was I guess a bit more of a divided response, or got more of a divided response in the survey that we ran. Had about 2/3 saying this was true, 1/3 saying it was false. Wonder which way we should go. I'm not, by the way, I'm trying not to be too overly negative here, because some of these are really still, controversial. So I don't mean to make them sound terribly bad all the way through. But anyway, moving on. Learning analytics. This is the Horizon report. If you're not familiar with it, is a report that's sort of generated in a number of places around the world on a semi-regular basis. There's one that runs here in Australia. There's another one that runs in Europe and UK, US, and so on. And they are looking for trends, future trends in education, trying to predict what trends will have an impact in years to come. And they tend to express that in something like learning analytics and when it will have an impact. The Horizon report here for 2012 showed that they thought that learning analytics was 1 year or less away. That seems pretty confident. It was on the horizon. The following year, well, it hadn't arrived, so it must be still only 1 year or less away. And then another year later, things hadn't eventuated, and people started to question this idea. Well, what are we actually talking about here? And in 2014, they said, well, it's probably further away than we think. We'll give it a bit more time to figure out what we actually mean by learning analytics first. There was an interesting study of that particular idea at a recent conference, the ASCII conference. And so I guess the take-home message is we want it now, but it's not as close as we think. And we're still trying to figure out what learning analytics means. And this is something I've been involved in a fair bit. So yeah, we're still asking what, how, and why. So we have to get our questions first before we can get the answers. We're sort of putting the cart before the horse, so to speak, when it comes to learning analytics. We want the answers, but we haven't figured out what answers we need. There is a simple question, and that is, will students succeed or not? But there are a lot of other questions as well. Here's a pertinent study that said that students' mastery orientation decreased and students' exposure to displays of their academic performance negatively predicts this change. In other words, we have to be careful how we use learning analytics, because if you tell a student that they're likely to fail, you're more than likely to encourage them to do so. So that's what this study found, that when students were given a view of their relative performance in relation to other students, it decreased their performance. And in the end, they were more likely to fail because they had been shown their relative performance. So it's good perhaps to show high-performing students that they're doing well. It's encouraging for them. It's another thing to warn students that they need to put in more effort. We have to be very careful how we express that, and maybe a bit more tactful with different segments of our learners in a course. All right. So this wasn't so much of an advice thing, but we still need to innovate analytics tools that benefit students, and we need to make sure that we come up with evidence that supports those benefits. We are talking a lot in and around Moodle. There's a lot of data that is available from learning management systems. It can be exported, it can be analyzed, and you can make use of that. How do we make that more immediate, more proactive, and so forth? We still have to obviously figure out well, what things do we need to be proactive about, and so on. And we need to be careful. At-risk prediction needs to be presented carefully, particularly to students, and how we deal with the information once we've got it has to be, carefully considered. All right, looking at the chat, not so much chatter about this one. I think we need to be careful of jumping to conclusions when we look at data that we collect. Absolutely, and I haven't even mentioned the ethical questions that go around this as well, and whether we should be collecting this, how much information we should be sharing with students, how much we should tell them about the information that we are collecting, and how we're using that. There have been a few questions of that both in the academic world and beyond, and it may be something that is considered as a legal issue in future. Okay. All right, we're nearing the conclusion. So these last ones here were, I put in there, they're not educationally related, just as a bit of a joke. Humans are responsible for global warming. My commendation to people, the 6 people who are brave enough to disagree with that. I don't necessarily want to express an opinion about that here. I think in some places, if you were to disagree with that publicly, you'd be taken out and shot or something these days. Anyway, moving on. Poor Stephen Hawking. Hello, Stephen. We're a fan of your work. Thank you very much. Aliens built their pyramids. I was just, yeah, okay. All right, there's a bunch of references there, and a copy of these slides is available on the course. For you to peruse in your own time, and I guess at this stage I'll throw control back to Merrin to say, ask people for questions and so on.
Hi, thanks so much for that, Michael. Very thought-provoking, and thanks for actually putting all those references at the end, because it's going to help us delve further on our own. Throwing it out there, does anybody want to ask Michael a specific question?
While people are typing in their questions, and please go ahead and do that, some of those references I've actually got in the papers and put them in the course. I assume that this is sort of a limited private gathering, and so therefore I've taken the liberty of sharing some of those actual papers on the course. I may take them down afterwards, but don't tell anyone. All right. Sometimes student progress is more motivation than learning. That's quite true. I am involved in a grant application, which is very preliminary, like it's been applied for. I'm not sure how it'll turn out, but basically looking at a measure of motivation and how we can then use that within the learning management system to direct learners down different learning paths. So personalization based on motivation. That's an interesting topic. Okay, thank you for, well, thanks. In another session, visual teaching was mentioned. What's your opinion about that? Visual teaching. Well, I think there have been studies that show that presenting something visually can be better than presenting it in a written form. I don't know if I would say that that's something that everybody should do, but I would suggest that presenting things in multiple ways has been, there's a lot of evidence to show that that can help. Not just presenting it in one stronger way, but presenting it in multiple different ways so that the learner can try and repeat that. We've fallen into the trap to assume that students learn things the first time we expose it to them, and that's just not true. Things need repetition. We need re-exposure. Students need to be exposed to something once to come to an understanding, and then to be re-exposed to that to reinforce the learning. That's what constructivism is about. over time. It's a significant component. So we shouldn't neglect this idea that, you know, we need to do that repetition. But in an online world, we kind of almost step back from that a bit. We want our nice, clean courses. We want lack of redundancy and things like that. It's not possible. We need to have the multiple presentations still. Badges as a motivational thing, yes, that's probably a good idea. Okay. Oh. Visual learning. There is a presentation in the schedule, I think, in a couple of hours, which is talking about learning styles. I'm really afraid of that presentation. Where is it? Anyway, coming up, I've got a repeat of this at 1 p.m. today, and sometime in between. Yes, at 10 a.m. for me. No, that's not it. Anyway, at some point there will be something talking about learning styles and how we can use them to enhance learning. I'm kind of half wanting to join that and half afraid of actually showing up because I might hurt somebody's feelings. My agency uses what is called the wheel, why it is important to them, what information they need, how it works hands-on, and what if you do differently. We call it learning styles, but it doesn't fit under the same category we've talked about. Yeah, I think the notion, just the terminology of learning styles has been a bit bastardized as well. I would, though, I mean, there's a lot of, if you've got a course design approach that's consistent across courses and you want to apply it across an institution or whatever, and you can get good support and cooperation, it's probably a good idea, but it's always worth challenging and looking for whether it's effective and refining it if it's not. Where does gamification fit into this? Into what in particular do you mean? I'm not sure, Andy. Which I've sort of raised a number of topics. Are you talking about learning styles or some other segment? Advances in research about the brain are discrediting learning styles. Yep, and if you look at some of the references that I've given, that's where this dichotomy has come about. Into the myths. I think gamification, there's been studies of whether it's effective or not, and it's been shown that it is motivational, and I think in those grounds it's worth considering. Sounds a bit hokey though, so maybe that's why people are concerned about it. I mean, how can learning be fun? That's not, I don't think, a problem for me, but yeah, I have seen some studies, but we'll see how that goes into the future. Maybe it's still a new topic of study, I would say. All right. So people are talking more about visual learning. Moodle and personality styles. Yeah. So it's probably not even related to what I'm talking about. Okay. Personality types. So that's on at 4 p.m. my time, which is quite a few hours from now. So I'll be off having fun with my family at that stage, I think, considering I'm starting early today. Yep. Okay. So wrapping things up.
You have started up. very early. Is there any last questions for Michael? We're just coming up to time. We've got time for another quick question before we let him get off to his family. Okay, we might leave it there. Thank you very much once again, Michael.
Thank you, everyone. I'm here all day. No, all week. No, it's a weekend. All right,
Okay.
have a good iMoot. Stay involved, everyone. And hopefully this will help you. Bye-bye.